The Alpha's decree split the Thornmere pack
back.
like lightning through ancient oak. Kahu Silverborn stood before his assembled wolves, one hand gripping his 6-year-old son's shoulder, the other extended toward a woman whose scent carried no wolf, no magic, no claim to their bloodline. "Bow to your new Luna," he commanded, his voice carved from granite and grief. But little Tama, heir to the Silverborn throne, bearer of the forbidden bloodline that ran silver in moonlight, didn't bow. The pup spat, right in her face, and screamed words that turned every wolf's blood to ice. "My real mommy is coming back," she promised. "Before we witness how this impossible promise shatters everything, tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug, because what happens next will break your heart and remake it in ways you never saw coming." The woman, Mir she called herself, just Mir, as if a Luna needed no surname, no history, no blood right, stood frozen. Saliva dripped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Didn't move. Her hazel eyes, painfully human, fixed on the child who just publicly rejected the bond that pack law demanded he accept. Around them, 300 wolves watched in suffocating silence. The Thornmere packhouse, carved into the volcanic stone of Mount Taranaki's shadow, had witnessed countless blood oaths, royal decrees, and succession ceremonies in its 800-year history. It had never witnessed this. Kahu's fingers tightened on his son's shoulder until the boy winced. "Tama, apologize." "No." The pup's voice cracked with fury and something deeper, the certainty that only children possess, the kind that adults mistake for delusion until it proves devastatingly true. "Mommy said she'd come back when the silver moon rises twice. That's only 4 days away. You lied to me." The crowd stirred. Whispers moved like poison through still water. Silver moon rising twice. Everyone knew what that meant. The celestial alignment that occurred once every 7 years, when the moon's reflection appeared simultaneously in both Lake Waikaramona and Lake Taupo due to some trick of atmosphere and angle that their ancestors had built prophecies around. 4 days. The timeline stabbed through Kahu's carefully constructed narrative like a blade through silk. Because 4 days ago, he'd told his son that his mother was never coming home, that she'd broken her blood oath, that she'd abandoned them for reasons Tama was too young to understand. And now this new woman stood on their sacred ground, wearing the Luna's ceremonial torque around her neck, the one that should have required the previous Luna's death or formal rejection to transfer. But Aroha Nightwhisper hadn't died, and she'd never formally rejected anything. The story actually began 7 years earlier, when Aroha Nightwhisper had done the impossible. She'd conceived an heir while carrying the forbidden bloodline. The Nightwhispers were descended from the first wolves, the ones who'd walked with gods before the separation, whose blood ran silver instead of red under the full moon's touch. Pack law, established 3 centuries ago after the bloodline wars nearly destroyed all shifter kind, was explicit. Nightwhispers could not reproduce. Their power was too great, too unstable, too likely to create abominations that would tear the veil between worlds. Any Nightwhisper who conceived was to terminate immediately or face execution along with the child. Aroha had chosen a third option. She'd hidden. For 9 months, she and Kahu had concealed her pregnancy with magic so old it required sacrifice. They'd bled themselves under new moons, carved runes into their own flesh. Aroha had bound her wolf so deeply that some days she forgot she had one, just to keep the bloodline dormant in her womb. And when Tama was born, perfect, healthy, carrying the silver in his veins but not yet manifested, they'd believed they'd won. The Council of Alphas had believed otherwise. They'd arrived on Tama's first birthday, 7 alphas representing the 7 great packs of New Zealand, and they'd brought the old laws written in blood and binding magic. Hannah Stormcaller, alpha of the Northland Pack and eldest of the council, had spoken with the weight of 300 years. "The child lives because you hid him. But pack law is pack law. Aroha Nightwhisper must choose. Exile for life, with a curse that ensures she can never return to any pack lands and can never contact her child again. Or execution for both mother and son. Those are the only paths that preserve the balance." Kahu had raged. He'd threatened war. He'd called on ancient alliances and older debts. But Aroha had simply looked at her son, then at her mate and said, I choose exile. But I need 7 years. The silver alignment. Let me remain until then, to ensure Thoma's wolf emerges stable. After that, I'll go willingly. They'd granted her request. A blood oath sealed it. Aroha Nightwhisper would remain with her pack until the next double silver moon, serving as Luna, raising her son, appearing to all as legitimate. Then she would walk into exile without resistance, and the Silverborn line would continue through Tama under Kahu's guidance alone. What the council hadn't known, what Kahu hadn't known, was that Aroha had planned her return from the moment she'd agreed to leave. Now, in the volcanic stone hall, that carefully constructed timeline was collapsing. Mir finally wiped the spit from her face with trembling fingers. She was pretty in an ordinary way. Brown hair, average height, curves that spoke of comfort rather than the lethal grace wolves carried. She'd been a teacher in Wellington before Kahu had approached her 6 months ago, after Aroha's departure. He'd been honest, or so he'd claimed. He needed a human Luna to help raise his son, someone who could teach Tama to navigate the human world his mixed bloodline would require him to walk in. Someone temporary, just until Tama came of age. He hadn't mentioned that he'd chosen her specifically because she was powerless. Because she could never threaten the council's decree or challenge their authority. 'Cause she was safe. Kahu, Mir whispered, her voice barely audible over the crowd's growing murmur. You said she was gone. You said the blood oath was final. It is final. But even as Kahu spoke, his hand dropped from Tama's shoulder. The boy bolted, running through the crowd before anyone could stop him. Wolves parted instinctively, unwilling to touch the heir who'd just committed public insubordination. Tama didn't stop until he reached the far wall, where ancient carvings depicted the first Silverborn Alpha receiving the pack's founding blessing. He pressed his small hands against the stone and screamed, Mommy! I didn't bow. I didn't bow like you said. The carvings began to glow. Silver light seeped from the stone like blood from a wound, tracing the ancient wolf shapes, making them move and breathe. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This wasn't possible. The sacred carvings hadn't responded to anything except alpha blood during formal ceremonies in 200 years. And they'd certainly never responded to a child. Unless that child carried the forbidden bloodline at its full manifestation. Rengi Iron Soul, Kahu's beta and closest friend since childhood, moved first. He crossed the hall in 3 strides, scooped Tama up despite the boy's shrieking protests, and carried him bodily toward the private chambers. The carving's light died the moment Rengi's hands touched the child. But the damage was done. Every wolf in that room had seen. Every wolf now knew that Tama Silverborn wasn't just carrying Nightwhisper blood. He was manifesting it years earlier than any medical assessment had predicted. Which meant the council's greatest fear was coming true. The forbidden bloodline was awakening. And in 4 days, when the silver moon rose twice, something else would awaken too. Hannah Stormcaller arrived before sunset, her convoy of Northland wolves rolling into Thornmere territory like a storm front. She didn't request entry. She didn't observe the traditional courtesies. She simply walked into Kahu's private study, where he sat with his head in his hands and said, Tell me you have this contained. Kahu looked up. He'd aged a decade in the 6 hours since Tama's outburst. Lines carved deep around his eyes, and his dark hair, which had held no gray that morning, showed silver threads at his temples. The boy thinks his mother is coming back. The boy. Or you. Hannah's 3-century-old eyes missed nothing. She settled into the chair across from him, her movements still carrying the predatory grace of a wolf in her prime despite her age. Because I watched your face during that disaster of a ceremony. Kahu Silverborn. You didn't look like an alpha whose mate had broken faith. You looked like an alpha waiting for her return. The blood oath is worded very carefully, I've discovered. Hannah pulled a scroll from her jacket, its edges yellowed with age. I went back to the original document after I heard about today. Aroha Nightwhisper agrees to walk into exile at the appointed time and will not resist the council's decree. Those were the exact words. She agreed not to resist the decree. Not to abandon her family. Not to stay gone. Just not to resist when forced into exile. The air in the study turned thick. Kahu's hands flattened on his desk. What are you saying? I'm saying your mate found a loophole the size of Mount Taranaki. She agreed to leave. She never agreed the leaving would be permanent. And based on what your son said, my real mommy is coming back. I'm guessing she told him exactly that before she walked away. The implications crashed through Kahu like a physical blow. Aroha had planned this. All of it. The blood oath hadn't been surrender. It had been strategy. She'd left to satisfy the council's demand for her removal from Pac lands. She'd gone into exile to prove she would honor the ancient laws. But she'd also bought time. 7 years to prepare. 7 years to find a way to return without breaking her oath. 7 years to ensure that when she came back, she'd come back with enough power or knowledge or allies that not even the council could force her into exile again. Where is she? Hannah's question cut like a blade. Where has Aroha Nightwhisper been for 6 months? I don't know. The admission cost Kahu something. The blood oath severed our mate bond. I can't feel her anymore. Can't track her. It was part of the exile terms. Complete separation of soul and spirit. I thought she was truly gone. Then you're a fool. Hannah stood, the scroll still in her hand. Because Aroha Nightwhisper didn't earn her surname by being powerless. The Nightwhispers were called that because they could hear the voices of the old magic, the words spoken in the dark places where gods used to walk. If she's been gone for 6 months without a trace, it means she's been somewhere those voices live. And if she's coming back in 4 days, it means she found what she was looking for. The story spread through Pac territories like wildfire. By midnight, every Alpha in New Zealand knew that Thomas Silverborn had manifested forbidden bloodline powers years ahead of schedule, and that his exiled mother had apparently promised to return. By dawn, delegations from 4 different packs had arrived at Thornmere, demanding explanations, calling emergency council sessions, threatening to invoke ancient protocols that could strip Kahu of his alpha status for failing to control his bloodline. Mir packed her bags that same dawn. She'd spent the night in guest quarters after Tama had refused to let her enter the family wing, the boy screaming and thrashing every time she came near. Now she stood in the entrance hall, her small suitcase at her feet, facing Kahu with something like pity in her human eyes. I knew this was temporary, she said quietly. You told me that from the start. But you didn't tell me I'd be a placeholder for a ghost. You didn't tell me that boy still had a mother who loved him enough to find a way back from exile. Aroha can't come back. But Kahu's voice carried no conviction. The blood oath. The blood oath said she had to leave. Past tense. Completed action. Mir shouldered her bag. I'm a teacher, remember? I know how words work. And I know how love works too. That woman left her son with a promise, Kahu. She left him with hope. What did you leave him with? A stranger wearing his mother's crown and a father who taught him to stop waiting. She walked out into the morning sunlight, past wolves who'd gathered to watch another failure, another crack in their alpha's foundation. No one stopped her. No one said goodbye. She'd never been part of the pack anyway. Just a human experiment in denying the inevitable. Tama watched from his bedroom window. His small face pressed against the glass. He didn't look sad or relieved. He looked vindicated. His real mommy was coming back, just like she'd promised. The grown-ups just didn't believe it yet. The council convened 3 days before the silver moon alignment. All 7 alphas gathered in the Thornmere Great Hall, their combined power turning the air electric. They sat in chairs carved from kauri trees that had been standing when Maori first arrived in New Zealand, each seat representing centuries of pack law and territory rights. Kahu stood before them, not as an alpha among equals, but as the accused before judges. Hannah Stormcaller spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of formal council proceedings. Kahu Silverborn, Alpha of the Thornmere Pack, you are called to account for violations of 3 sacred laws. First, concealing the manifestation of forbidden bloodline powers in your heir. Second, allowing a blood oath exile to establish return conditions through your son. Third, placing a human in the Luna's position without council approval or traditional ceremonies. How do you answer these charges? The hall held 300 wolves plus visiting pack members. Every breath, every heartbeat synchronized into a collective judgment. Kahu felt their attention like pressure against his skin. He'd been Alpha for 23 years, since his father's death in the last territorial war. He'd expanded Thornmere's borders, strengthened their alliances, guided his pack through economic collapse and natural disasters. He'd been strong, decisive, unchallenged. Until Aroha. I answer that I broke no laws, Kahu said. His voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Tama's bloodline manifestation occurred 3 days ago, in public before witnesses. I didn't conceal it. I discovered it at the same moment you did. The blood oath with Aroha contains no clause preventing her from speaking to our son before her exile. And placing Mir in the Luna's position was temporary, practical, and within my rights as Alpha to manage my household as I see fit. Technically accurate, Hannah acknowledged. And completely missing the point. You knew Aroha was coming back. I knew she'd promised Tama she would try. That's different from knowing she'd succeed. Is it? Warmu Ashbourne, Alpha of the South Island Pack, leaned forward. He was younger than Hannah but carried scars from battles that made his age irrelevant. Because it seems to me you've spent 6 months preparing for her return. You didn't truly bond with the human replacement. You didn't begin the formal process of severing your mate bond with Aroha, which you could have done after the first 3 months of exile per pack law. You kept your son believing his mother would come home. Those aren't the actions of an Alpha accepting reality. Those are the actions of an Alpha keeping the door open. The accusation hung in the air. Kahu felt other Alphas' eyes on him, assessing, calculating. Pack law functioned on precedent and perception. If the council decided he'd deliberately undermined Aroha's exile, they could remove him as Alpha. They could take Tama into council custody. They could declare the Silverborn line compromised and absorb Thornmere into another pack's territory. I kept the door open, Kahu admitted, the words tasting like betrayal and relief simultaneously, because my mate is the smartest person I've ever met, and if she promised our son she'd find a way back, then she meant it. And because pack law or not, council decrees or not, I've spent 6 months realizing that I should have fought harder 7 years ago. I should have challenged the exile. I should have told the council that forbidding Nightwhispers from reproducing is based on fear, not facts, and that my son is living proof that the forbidden bloodline doesn't create monsters, it creates miracles. The hall erupted. Half the wolves surged to their feet in outrage, the other half in something like approval. Alphas shouted over each other. Pack bonds strained as wolves chose sides, those who believed in absolute adherence to ancient law versus those who'd been quietly questioning whether the Nightwhisper prohibition had ever been justified. Rengi Ironsoul, standing guard at the chamber entrance, caught Kahu's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. His beta had his back whatever came next. Hannah Stormcaller's power crashed through the chaos like a tsunami. The 300-year-old Alpha didn't shout. She simply released a fraction of her true presence, and every wolf in the room froze, their instincts screaming submission before they could think. Into the sudden silence she said, "Sit down, Asat." Hannah fixed Kahu with those ancient eyes. "You understand what you've just done. You've challenged 3 centuries of precedent. You've called into question the entire legal framework that's kept our packs from tearing each other apart over bloodline purity disputes. And you've done it publicly, in front of witnesses, which means this moment will be recorded in pack history and cited in every council proceeding for the next 100 years. I understand, Kahu said. I'm also right. Maybe. Hannah's admission shocked the room into deeper silence. Maybe the Nightwhisper prohibition was always about power, not safety. Maybe the first councils looked at wolves who could hear the old magic and decided they were too dangerous to control, so they created laws that eliminated the threat instead of understanding it. Maybe we've been wrong for 300 years. She paused, letting the implications settle. Or maybe you're a fool who's about to prove our ancestors right by allowing a forbidden bloodline to destabilize everything we've built. There's a way to find out, Kahu said quietly. Let Aroha come back. Let her explain where she's been and what she's learned. Judge her and our son based on truth, not fear. And if she's become exactly what the old laws warned against. If she spent 6 months in the dark places learning magic that could destroy the veil between worlds. If bringing her back means unleashing something we can't contain. Wiremu Ashbourne's questions weren't rhetorical. They were genuine fears shared by half the council. Then I'll stop her myself. Kahu's promise carried the weight of blood oath. But I won't condemn her without evidence. And I won't teach my son that love and loyalty mean nothing against politics and precedent. The council withdrew to deliberate. They took Tama with them, a 6-year-old boy suddenly at the center of a legal and philosophical battle that could reshape Pack society. The child went willingly. His small hand in Hannah Stormcaller's weathered one. His silver-touched eyes bright with something between excitement and terror. Is Mommy really coming tomorrow? He asked as they led him away. We're about to find out, Hannah answered, the only honest response anyone had given him in days. Night fell over Thornmere. Kahu stood alone in his study, staring at the one photograph he'd kept of Aroha. She'd been laughing when he'd taken it, her dark hair catching sunlight, her eyes, the silver just visible if you knew to look, bright with joy. That had been 8 years ago, before the pregnancy, before the council, before everything had shattered. He picked up his phone and did something he hadn't done in 6 months. He tried to call her. The mate bond was severed, but they'd had human phone numbers too, mundane connections that Pack magic couldn't touch. The call went straight to voicemail. Same recorded message he'd heard 100 times. This is Aroha. Leave a message if it matters. It matters, Kahu said to the silence. Tomorrow's the silver moon. Tama's waiting for you. The council's waiting for you. His voice caught. I'm waiting for you. But you need to know what you're walking into. They're calling for your arrest the moment you cross Pack borders. They're threatening to take Tama into custody. Hannah Stormcaller is the only thing standing between me and a vote of no confidence. And if you've done anything in exile that violates Pack law or threatens the veil, I can't protect you. I want to. God's Aroha, I'd burn the whole system down to protect you and our son. But I'm also Alpha. I can't choose family over Pack. You taught me that. He hung up, knowing she wouldn't respond. Knowing the voicemail would probably never reach her. But saying the words aloud had mattered, at least to him. A knock at the door interrupted his spiral. Rengi entered without waiting for permission, carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey that predated their grandparents. Figured you could use this. They drank in silence for a while. Then Rengi said, She's coming back, you know. Can feel it. Something in the air changed tonight. That's just the council's power. They've been throwing their weight around all day. No. This is different. Rengi moved to the window, looking out at Mount Taranaki's silhouette against the stars. You remember when we were kids, right before the volcanic scare in '98? How the mountain felt different for days before the scientists even detected the seismic activity. How the birds left and the air tasted like copper. Kahu joined him at the window. Now that Rengi mentioned it, yes, the night did feel different. Charged. Waiting. You think Aroha's return will be like a volcanic eruption? I think your mate spent 6 months learning secrets that were deliberately buried 3 centuries ago. I think she's coming back with power that's going to force the council to rewrite their precious laws. And I think tomorrow, when that silver moon rises twice, everyone's going to remember why the Nightwhispers were actually called that. Rengi turned to face Kahu directly. The question is, are you ready to stand with her when that happens? Even if it costs you your Pack. Even if it costs you your son. I already lost them once by following the rules, Kahu said quietly. I'm not making that mistake again. The double silver moon rose at 9:47 p.m. The exact moment had been calculated by Pack astronomers weeks in advance, when the moon's position would create perfect reflections in both sacred lakes simultaneously, an alignment that occurred only once every 7 years and had been sacred to wolves since before written history. Every pack in New Zealand had members gathered at one lake or the other, watching, waiting, participating in the ancient observation that connected them to their ancestors. At Lake Taupo, Kahu stood with Tama on the rocky shore, surrounded by Thornmere pack members and council observers. The boy clutched his father's hand with desperate strength, his young eyes fixed on the water where moonlight turned the surface to liquid silver. Hannah Stormcaller stood 3 paces behind them, flanked by enforcers from 5 different packs, insurance against whatever was coming. She'll be here, Tama whispered for the 100th time. She promised. Kahu didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because as the moon's reflection solidified on the water, he felt something he hadn't felt in 6 months. A tug on the severed mate bond. Faint, distant but unmistakable. Aroha was close. The lake's surface began to ripple despite the windless night. Small waves spread outward from the center, defying physics, moving in patterns that resembled ancient symbols. Wolves around the shore stepped back instinctively. Some shifted halfway, caught between forms by the primal recognition of power greater than their own. The water's temperature dropped. Kahu could see his breath suddenly, though the night had been warm moments ago. Then the lake spoke. Not with sound, with presence, with meaning that bypassed ears and embedded directly in consciousness. Every wolf present heard it simultaneously. She who was sent away returns. She who walked in dark places comes bearing old light. She who was forbidden brings proof of permission. Impossible, Hannah breathed. That's the voice of the old magic. The one the first Nightwhispers could hear. That's been silent for. The lake's center exploded upward. Not violently, but absolutely. Water rose in a column 10 meters high, silver moonlight making it glow like liquid mercury. And standing within that column, suspended between lake and sky, was Aroha Nightwhisper. She looked exactly as Kahu remembered. Dark hair now streaked with actual silver, not gray but metallic threads that caught light like spun starlight. Her eyes, always silver-touched before, now shone completely silver. No iris, no pupil, just pure luminous power. She wore traditional Maori clothing that looked woven from shadows and moonlight simultaneously, and around her neck hung a pendant carved from stone that didn't exist in the natural world. Black but somehow radiating light, pulsing with each beat of her heart. Thomas screamed, "Mommy!" and would have run into the lake if Kahu hadn't grabbed him. The boy thrashed with supernatural strength. His own forbidden bloodline responding to his mother's presence, recognizing pack, recognizing family, recognizing the source of his own power. Aroha's feet touched the water's surface. The column collapsed around her, but she didn't sink. She stood on the lake as if it were solid ground, each step sending ripples of silver light outward, and walked toward shore. Toward her son. Toward her mate. Toward the council that had exiled her and the laws that had forbidden her return. When she was 3 meters from shore, close enough to speak but far enough to flee if needed, she stopped. Her silver eyes swept across the gathered wolves, assessing, calculating. Then she looked at Kahu, and despite the alien power radiating from her, he saw the woman he'd loved for 30 years beneath it all. "Hello, Kahu," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made his wolf whimper with submission and longing simultaneously. "I believe I'm right on time." The council moved to arrest her immediately. Enforcers from 3 packs rushed forward, their hands already manifesting the binding magic that council authority allowed them to wield. But before they reached the water's edge, Aroha raised one hand and they stopped. Not because she attacked them, but because the lake itself rose between them, a wall of water that held its shape impossibly, defying gravity, held in place by will alone. "I invoke the right of return," Aroha announced, her voice carrying across the lake to reach wolves stationed on distant shores. By the old laws that predate the council, by the first agreements made between wolves and the magic that created us, I claim the right to return to my pack after voluntary exile, provided I bring proof of worth and value gained during my absence. Hannah Stormcaller's expression shifted from shock to something like respect. The right of return hasn't been successfully invoked in 200 years. The proof requirements are substantial. I know. Aroha's free hand touched the pendant at her neck. I've spent 6 months in the Waitomo system, in the caves that run deeper than any human exploration has mapped, where the old magic still lives in darkness and stone. I went searching for the truth about Nightwhispers. Not the laws written by councils 3 centuries ago, but the original reasons our bloodline was gifted with the ability to hear the voices of power. She gestured, and the water wall dissolved, but not before forming into shapes. Images made of liquid and light that hung in the air like living memories. The wolves watching saw scenes from an ancient past. Nightwhisper wolves walking through forests that no longer existed, speaking with entities that were neither animal nor human, learning the languages of magic directly from the sources that had created shifter kind in the first place. We weren't forbidden because we were dangerous, Aroha continued. Her voice steady despite the massive power expenditure these illusions required. We were forbidden because we were too close to the source. Because the councils that formed after the separation wanted control over pack society. And they couldn't control wolves who could verify truth directly through the old magic. So they created the myth that Nightwhispers who reproduced would birth abominations. They pointed to 3 historical cases where Nightwhisper children went mad and caused destruction. And they used those 3 cases to justify eliminating an entire bloodline's right to continue. The waterlight images shifted, showing different scenes. Nightwhisper children throughout history, most of them living normal lives, their power manifesting as nothing more dangerous than heightened intuition and the occasional ability to sense disturbances in pack bonds. Then 3 children, the 3 cases the council had built their laws around, who'd been driven mad not by their bloodline but by the persecution they'd faced. Children who'd watched their parents executed, who'd been isolated and feared, who'd broken under treatment that would have destroyed anyone's sanity. I can prove this, Aroha said. I spent 6 months speaking with the old magic, learning the true history, documenting everything. I have testimonies from entities that predate our recorded history. I have evidence that the Nightwhisper prohibition was political, not protective. And I have a son, our son, who carries the forbidden bloodline at full manifestation and hasn't harmed anyone. Who manifested his power out of love and loyalty, not violence and chaos. The water-light images dissolved. Aroha stepped onto solid ground for the first time in 6 months, her feet touching Thornmere territory, technically breaking her exile. Council enforcers tensed, but Hannah Stormcaller raised a hand, stopping them. The ancient Alpha approached Aroha directly, stopping only when they were close enough to speak quietly, though every wolf present could hear them anyway. Supernatural hearing ensured no secrets in pack gatherings. Prove it, Hannah said simply. Right now. Prove that your son isn't dangerous. Aroha looked past her to where Kahu still held Tama, the boy straining against his father's grip, desperate to reach his mother. Kahu. Let him go. Every instinct Kahu possessed screamed against it. Tama was barely 6. His power newly manifested, unstable. Aroha had been gone for 6 months, learning magic that clearly went beyond normal pack abilities. Letting the 2 of them connect here now, with the council watching and enforcers ready to strike at the first sign of danger. It was insane. He let his son go. Tama ran. His small legs carried him across the rocky shore, past wolves who'd known him since birth, past council members who'd voted to exile his mother, straight into Aroha's arms. She caught him, lifted him, held him as he sobbed into her shoulder. And as their blood connection re-established, mother and son, Nightwhisper to Nightwhisper, forbidden bloodline to forbidden bloodline, power exploded outward. Not destructively, but absolutely unmistakably. Silver light poured from both of them, washing across the assembled wolves, through pack bonds and individual auras, touching everyone present with a distinctive signature of Nightwhisper magic. And in that moment, every wolf felt what Tama and Aroha were feeling. Love. Pure, uncomplicated, fierce protective love. Nothing dark. Nothing chaotic. Nothing that suggested madness or danger. Just a mother reunited with her son. The light faded. Aroha and Tama remained on the shore, the boy still clinging to her. Her arms wrapped around him as if she'd never let go again. She looked up at the council, at Hannah's Stormcaller specifically, and said, "That is what forbidden bloodline power looks like when it's not persecuted, not feared, not forced into hiding and exile. That is what we could have had 3 centuries ago if the first councils had chosen understanding over control." Wiremu Ashbourne, the scarred alpha from the South Island, spoke from his position near the enforcers. "You're asking us to overturn 300 years of law based on one demonstration and stories from entities we can't verify? The Nightwhisper prohibition exists in every pack's legal code. Changing it would require unanimous council agreement and a complete restructuring of our governance frameworks." "I'm not asking you to change anything tonight," Aroha replied. "I'm asking you to give me a chance to present my full evidence at a formal council hearing. Let me show you everything I learned. Let experts examine my son. Medical, magical, whatever tests you need to prove he's not a threat. And if, after all that, you still believe the Nightwhisper prohibition is justified, I'll accept exile again. Permanent this time with no loopholes, no return conditions. Just let me prove my case first." "And if we refuse?" Hannah asked. Aroha's silver eyes hardened. "Then I'll take my son and disappear somewhere even the council can't find us. And you'll spend the rest of your lives wondering what I really learned in those caves, and whether I'm coming back with others who also remember the old ways." The threat hung in the air like a blade. Kahu watched Hannah's face carefully, seeing the calculations running behind those ancient eyes. The Stormcaller Alpha was weighing options, measuring risks, considering precedents. Around her, other council members shifted nervously. They'd come here expecting to either arrest a fugitive or confirm an exile. They hadn't expected this. A Nightwhisper who'd gained power beyond normal pack abilities, offering a bargain that could destabilize their entire legal system or validate it completely, depending on how her evidence held up. "1 week, Hannah finally said. "We'll convene a formal council hearing at the neutral grounds in Wellington. You'll present your evidence. We'll bring in experts. Medical specialists who understand bloodline manifestations, historians who've studied the separation period, magical practitioners who can verify whether your claims about the old magic are legitimate. Your son will undergo testing, voluntary and supervised, to assess his power stability. And at the end of 1 week, the council will vote on whether to maintain the Nightwhisper prohibition or revise it." "And until then?" Aroha asked. "Until then, you remain in Thornmere territory under Kahu's supervision. You don't leave pack lands. You don't attempt to contact other Nightwhispers or their descendants. You don't perform any magic beyond what's necessary for daily pack life. Consider it monitored reintegration pending council judgment." It wasn't what Aroha had hoped for. She'd wanted immediate acceptance, recognition that she'd been wronged, vindication. But it was better than arrest or renewed exile. She looked to Kahu, seeing the question in his eyes. "Can you accept these terms?" She nodded. Hannah gestured to her enforcers. They approached cautiously, and Aroha allowed them to place a tracking bracelet on her wrist. Not binding magic, but close, a piece of technology infused with pack power that would monitor her location and alert the council if she attempted to leave Thornmere. The bracelet felt heavy, symbolic. A reminder that she was still under judgment, still not free, still not fully trusted. But she was home. Tama hadn't let go of her since their reunion. Now he pulled back enough to look at her face. His small hand touching her cheek where tears had started falling. "You came back," he whispered, the words carrying wonder and relief. "Just like you promised." "Always," Aroha promised. "I will always come back for you." The council dispersed, most members returning to their pack territories to begin the complex process of preparing for a hearing that could reshape centuries of tradition. Hannah's Stormcaller remained, along with a half-dozen enforcers who would clearly be staying in Thornmere for the next week to monitor the situation. She approached Kahu as he finally moved to join his mate and son, stopping him with a hand on his shoulder. "You're gambling everything on this," Hannah said quietly. "Your alpha status, your pack's reputation, your son's future. If her evidence doesn't hold up, the council won't just exile her again. They'll likely remove you and put Tama in protective custody until he comes of age under a different alpha's guardianship." "I know," Kahu replied. "But she's right. The prohibition was always about fear and control, not safety. Tama proves that. And if fighting for my family costs me everything else, then that's a price I'm willing to pay." Hannah studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Your father would either be proud of you or horrified by you. Possibly both." She released his shoulder. "Make sure she's ready for that hearing. Make sure her evidence is airtight. Because I'm going into this wanting to believe her. And I'm 300 years old. I've seen what happens when councils make laws based on fear rather than facts. But I'm also one voice among 7, and the other 6 are terrified of what validating Nightwhispers could mean for their own authority and control." The walk back to the pack house felt simultaneously eternal and instantaneous. Aroha held Tama's hand on one side, Kahu's on the other, forming a family unit that had been broken for 6 months and was now tentatively reforming. Pack members lined their path, some watching with hope, others with suspicion, all with uncertainty. The rumor of what had happened at the lake was already spreading through Thornmere, enhanced by those who'd witnessed it remotely through pack bond connections. Inside the family quarters, Aroha finally set Tama down, though the boy immediately attached himself to her leg, unwilling to let go. She looked around the room she'd left 6 months ago, seeing both what had changed and what hadn't. Kahu had kept her belongings. Photos still on walls, her favorite reading chair in the same position, her books on the shelves. But he'd also brought in evidence of the human woman, Mir. A different scent in the air, small decorative changes, the subtle markers of someone else attempting to make this space their own. "She's gone," Kahu said, reading her thoughts. "Left 3 days ago after Tama rejected her." "I heard about that." Aroha knelt down to her son's level. "Tama, we need to talk about what you did. Spitting on someone, even if you didn't want her here, wasn't okay. It was disrespectful and hurtful." "But she's not you," Tama protested. "Daddy said I had to call her Luna, but she's not Luna. You are. Being Luna isn't about titles, baby. It's about service and care and putting the pack's needs alongside your own. That woman came here trying to help, trying to take care of you, even though she knew she'd never fully fit into our world. And you humiliated her in front of everyone." Aroha brushed hair from Tama's forehead, her touch gentle despite her serious tone. "When this is all over, when the council makes their decision, you're going to write her an apology. A real one that acknowledges you were wrong. Do you understand?" Tama nodded reluctantly. Kahu watched them, something in his chest loosening. This was what had been missing. Not just Aroha's presence, but her parenting, her ability to love fiercely while teaching accountability. Her refusal to let their son believe that being special meant being exempt from basic decency. "Where did you really go?" Kahu asked when Tama had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by emotion and power manifestation, curled up in his bed with his mother sitting beside him. "The caves, the old magic. What did you actually find?" Aroha gestured for him to follow her to the study. Once inside with the door closed and privacy wards activated, she pulled out a leather journal filled with handwriting in multiple languages, some human, some in the old script that predated modern pack writing systems. "I went to the Waitomo Caves because they're the deepest natural cave system in New Zealand, and because Nightwhisper oral tradition said that's where some of the first wolves went to commune with the entities that created our kind during the separation," Aroha explained. "Most shifters think the separation was when magic left the world, when the gods and old powers withdrew and left humanity to develop on its own. But that's not what happened. The separation was when the old powers stopped walking openly and started existing in the spaces between, in deep caves, in ancient forests, in places where the veil between worlds is thin. She opened the journal to pages covered in sketches, beings that looked almost humanoid but distorted, as if reality couldn't quite contain their full shapes. There are things living in those caves, Kahu. Conscious, intelligent entities that remember when shifters were created, that still hold the original agreements and purposes. They're not gods, they're more like custodians of fundamental forces. And they remember the Nightwhispers. They remember why we were given the ability to hear them. Over the next 3 days, Aroha prepared her case with the intensity of someone fighting for not just her life but her entire bloodline's future. She compiled testimonies from the cave entities, not as recordings. Such beings couldn't be recorded on human technology, but as witnesses. 3 of them agreed to manifest at the council hearing, an unprecedented event that required complex magical preparation and negotiation. She gathered historical documents from Nightwhisper families who'd kept records hidden from council oversight for centuries, showing lineages of children who'd lived normal, stable lives despite carrying the supposedly dangerous bloodline. Kahu coordinated with medical experts willing to examine Tama, putting his son through tests that measured everything from basic health to power manifestation patterns to psychological stability. Every result came back the same: exceptionally healthy, emotionally well-adjusted, power levels high but completely controlled for his age. Nothing suggesting instability or danger. Nothing to justify the 3-century prohibition. But not everyone in Thornmere was celebrating. On the 4th day of Aroha's return, Rengi Ironsoul came to Kahu with news that made his blood run cold. There's a faction forming. Pack members who think you're choosing your mate over pack safety. They're saying you've been compromised by the mate bond, that you can't think clearly when it comes to Aroha, that the council should remove you as alpha before you endanger the entire pack by legitimizing Nightwhisper power. How many? Kahu asked. 37 members at last count. Led by Rawiri Stonefong. Rengi's expression was grim. Rawiri was old guard, a pack elder who'd served under Kahu's father and had never fully accepted Kahu's more progressive leadership style. He's arguing that even if Aroha's evidence is valid, bringing back Nightwhisper bloodlines will make Thornmere a target. That other packs will see us as harboring dangerous power. That we'll face isolation or aggression from territories that want to maintain the traditional prohibitions. He's not entirely wrong, Kahu admitted. If the council validates Nightwhispers, it will cause massive upheaval. Some packs will resist. There could be conflicts, possibly violence. Are you having second thoughts? I'm having all the thoughts. Kahu moved to the window of his study, looking out at Thornmere territory, forests and volcanic plains that his family had protected for 8 generations. But then I think about Tama, about what kind of world I want him to grow up in. One where he has to hide what he is, fear his own power, accept that the circumstances of his birth make him unacceptable to half of pack society. Or one where he can be fully himself, use his gifts openly, maybe even help other Nightwhispers come out of hiding and contribute to pack society instead of being forced to suppress their abilities. The second one is idealistic, Rengi pointed out. The first one is realistic. The first one is what we've had for 3 centuries, and it hasn't worked. Kahu turned from the window. How many Nightwhispers have been forced to choose between their power and their families? How much potential has been lost because we were too afraid to question laws based on 3 tragic cases and centuries-old politics? Aroha is giving us a chance to fix that. I'm taking it. Even if it costs you your pack. Even then. The night before the council hearing, Rawiri Stonefong made his move. He called an emergency pack meeting, invoking ancient rights that allowed any member to challenge alpha decisions that threatened pack survival. Kahu couldn't refuse the meeting without looking like he was suppressing dissent, so at midnight, the entire Thornmere pack gathered in their ceremonial grounds, the same volcanic stone hall where Tama had spat in Mir's face just 1 week ago. 300 wolves arranged in traditional concentric circles, with Rawiri standing in the center. He was 78 years old, scarred from a lifetime of pack defense. His hair completely white but his frame still powerful. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of age and experience. Kahu Silverborn has led us well for 23 years. I don't question his courage or dedication. But I stand here tonight to say he is compromised. The mate bond has blinded him to the very real dangers his family represents. Rawiri's gaze swept across the crowd. We all saw what happened at the lake. We felt the power radiating from Aroha Nightwhisper. That kind of magic hasn't been seen in our territories in centuries, and there's a reason for that. Because our ancestors, wiser than us, recognized it as destabilizing and dangerous. Murmurs of agreement from portions of the crowd. Others remained silent, watching, waiting. Tomorrow, the council will hear evidence that supposedly proves Nightwhispers aren't dangerous. But evidence can be manipulated. Testimonies from cave entities. Who can verify those? Historical records kept hidden from council oversight. Why were they hidden if not to conceal something? And the child, yes, young Thomas seems stable now. But he's 6 years old. His power has barely begun to manifest. What happens in 10 years? 20. When he's fully grown and carrying abilities that exceed normal pack members by orders of magnitude. Rawiri turned to face Kahu directly. I call for a vote of confidence. Does Thornmere Pack still trust Kahu Silverborn to put pack safety above personal attachments? Or do we need new leadership that can make hard decisions without compromise? The challenge landed like a physical blow. A vote of confidence, if lost, would strip Kahu of alpha status immediately. The pack would choose a new alpha, likely Rawiri himself as the one who'd called the vote, and Kahu would be reduced to ordinary pack member status. He'd have no authority to protect Aroha or Tama, no ability to influence the council hearing, no power to prevent whatever consequences came next. Aroha started to stand from her position in the audience, but Kahu caught her eye and shook his head. This had to be his fight, his response. If she intervened, it would only prove Rawiri's point about him being too close to the situation to lead effectively. Kahu stepped into the center circle with Rawiri. You're right, he said, the words shocking most of the crowd. I am compromised. Every parent is compromised when it comes to their children. Every mate is compromised when it comes to their bond partner. That's not weakness. That's what makes us different from lone wolves and monsters. We care about individuals, not just concepts. We fight for families, not just territories. He turned slowly, addressing the entire pack. Rawiri says my judgment is clouded by the mate bond. But his judgment is clouded by fear of change. He's comfortable with laws that have existed his entire lifetime, and the idea of questioning them terrifies him. And that's understandable. Change is terrifying. Especially change this fundamental. Kahu continued, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was risking. But consider what we're actually afraid of. We're afraid of Nightwhisper power. Why? Because 3 children 300 years ago caused destruction after watching their families destroyed and being persecuted their entire lives. 3 cases. In 3 centuries. By that logic, we should exile or execute everyone whose power manifests unusually strongly, because statistical outliers always exist. We should fear all powerful wolves, not just Nightwhispers. He gestured toward where Aroha sat with Tama. My mate spent 6 months learning the truth about her bloodline. She could have used that time to gather allies, to build an army of other hidden Nightwhispers, to prepare for war against the council and packs that exiled her. Instead, she came back with evidence, with testimonies, with a willingness to submit to testing and oversight. That's not the behavior of someone planning to destabilize pack society. That's someone fighting for justice within the system, no matter how flawed that system has been toward her. Pretty words, Rawiri countered. But words don't protect us if you're wrong. If the council validates Nightwhispers and we become the pack that harbored the first one to return in modern times, we'll be watched, judged, potentially targeted by territories that see us as threatening the status quo. Your gamble affects every wolf here, not just your family. You're absolutely right, Kahu agreed. My decision does affect everyone. That's what leadership is. making choices that have consequences for others and accepting responsibility for those consequences. But let me ask you this, Rawiri. What kind of pack do we want to be? One that enforces unjust laws because changing them might be uncomfortable. One that sacrifices individuals to maintain stability. Or one that stands up for truth even when it's difficult. One that survives. Rawiri shot back. Principles don't matter if we're absorbed into another pack's territory or destroyed by conflicts over bloodline policies. Survival without principles is just existence. Kahu's voice hardened. And if that's all Thornmere offers, mere existence under whatever laws keep us safest, then maybe we don't deserve to survive as a pack. Maybe we deserve to be absorbed by others who still remember that we're supposed to be better than our fears. The hall fell silent. Every wolf present felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about Aroha or Tama or even Nightwhisper prohibitions. This was about identity. About what kind of community they wanted to be when faced with choices between comfort and justice, safety and truth. Hannah Stormcaller's voice cut through the tension from where she'd been observing. This is pack business, and I'm an outside, but may I speak? Kahu nodded. The ancient Alpha moved into the center circle, flanked by both men. I've led the Northland pack for 300 years. I was there when the Nightwhisper prohibition was debated and passed. And I can tell you that Kahu Silverborn is correct. It was based on fear and political convenience, not evidence. The 3 cases used to justify it were tragedies, yes. But they were also children who'd been tortured by prejudice before their power ever manifested. She paused, letting that sink in. We created the very monsters we claimed to be protecting against. And we've spent 3 centuries pretending otherwise because admitting that truth would mean acknowledging we've persecuted innocent families for political reasons. Rawiri's face reddened. You're saying the council was wrong. That 3 centuries of law should be overturned because we might have been mistaken. I'm saying that laws should serve justice, not just tradition. And when they don't, we have an obligation to change them. Hannah turned to face the assembled pack. Tomorrow's hearing will present evidence that should have been heard 300 years ago. Whatever the council decides, Thornmere Pack will have to choose whether to honor that decision or break from council authority entirely. That's the real question before you tonight. Do you trust your alpha to navigate that choice, or do you want someone who'll simply follow orders regardless of their justice? The vote took 2 hours. Every adult pack member cast their decision through the ancient pack bond mechanism. A mental yes or no that couldn't be faked or coerced, that carried the weight of genuine belief. Kahu stood in the center circle the entire time, feeling each vote as it registered, trying not to react to the running tally only alphas could sense. When the last vote came in, Rengi Ironsoul announced the results. 212 wolves support Alpha Silverborn's continued leadership. 88 believe new leadership is needed. The vote of confidence is sustained. Relief flooded through Kahu, but he kept his expression neutral. 70% support was solid but not overwhelming. 88 pack members, nearly a third of Thornmere, thought he was wrong, dangerous, compromised. Those wolves wouldn't suddenly change their minds based on this vote. They'd remain opposition, skeptics, potential problems if the council hearing didn't go perfectly. Rawiri inclined his head stiffly, accepting the decision with the grace of an elder who understood pack unity mattered more than his personal defeat. I spoke my concerns. The pack has decided. I will respect that decision and support our alpha in tomorrow's hearing. He paused, then added quietly so only Kahu could hear. But I pray you're right. Because if you're wrong, it won't just be your family that pays the price. The gathering dissolved, wolves returning to their homes in the late hours before dawn. Kahu found Aroha waiting for him outside, Tama asleep in her arms. She'd watched the entire proceeding through the pack bond connection, felt every vote, understood how close he'd come to losing everything. 212, she said softly. That's enough, right? That's enough for you to maintain authority. It's enough for now. Kahu touched Tama's sleeping face, the boy's features peaceful despite the chaos surrounding his existence. But Rawiri's right about one thing. If the hearing doesn't go well, if the council rejects your evidence or imposes restrictions on Nightwhispers that Thornmere can't accept, we'll fracture. The pack will split between those who support our family and those who think we're endangering everyone. Then we need the hearing to go perfectly. Aroha's silver eyes met his. Tomorrow I prove 3 centuries of councils wrong, or I lose everything. No pressure. Kahu pulled both of them close, his mate and son, the family he'd fought for and would keep fighting for no matter the cost. You won't be alone. Whatever happens in that hearing, we face it together. All 3 of us. Together, Aroha agreed. Even if together means exile. Even then. They stood there in the pre-dawn darkness, a family reunited but not yet safe, powerful but not yet vindicated, together but not yet free. Tomorrow would determine everything. Tomorrow the council would judge whether 3 centuries of law and tradition outweighed the truth standing right in front of them. Tomorrow would change Pack society forever, one way or another. The council convened at Wellington's neutral grounds at exactly 10 a.m. The facility had been built specifically for inter-pack gatherings, a massive hall carved from native stone, warded with magic that prevented violence and ensured no pack could claim territorial advantage. 7 alphas sat in their traditional positions, forming a semicircle that faced a central platform where Aroha would present her evidence. But the alphas weren't alone. The hearing had drawn attention from across New Zealand's Shifter community. Every pack had sent representatives. Historians, medical experts, legal scholars, all arranged in tiered seating that surrounded the central chamber. And behind them, separated by magical barriers but allowed to observe, were civilians, wolves from every territory who'd come to witness a moment that could reshape their entire society. Thomas sat with Kahu in the family section, wearing formal traditional clothing that made him look simultaneously very young and surprisingly dignified. The boy had been quiet all morning, his silver-touched eyes serious, understanding in that instinctive way children sometimes have that today was important beyond his full comprehension. Aroha stood on the central platform alone, her journal and carefully prepared evidence arranged before her. She wore Nightwhisper traditional garments, black with silver thread that seemed to move of its own accord, catching light that shouldn't exist in the carefully controlled illumination. The pendant from the caves hung around her neck, pulsing with each heartbeat, visible proof of her claims about the old magic. Hannah Stormcaller called the proceedings to order. We convened to hear evidence regarding the Nightwhisper prohibition, specifically whether the 3-century-old law forbidding Nightwhisper reproduction and relegating carriers of that bloodline to exile or execution serves legitimate safety purposes or constitutes unjust persecution. Aroha Nightwhisper, you invoked the right of return and promised to provide proof of your bloodline's value and safety. Present your evidence. Aroha began with history. She displayed documents, some from public archives, others from Nightwhisper families who'd hidden them for generations, showing the actual context of the 3 cases used to justify the prohibition. She brought forward testimony from historians who confirmed that in each case, the child who'd eventually caused destruction had first endured years of persecution, isolation, and watching their families destroyed by zealous enforcement of early bloodline laws. They weren't mad because they were Nightwhispers, Aroha argued, her voice carrying across the hall. They were mad because we drove them mad. We took children who'd lost everything, who'd been taught their existence was wrong, who'd watched their parents executed, and we isolated them further. And when predictably they broke under that treatment, we used their breakdowns as proof that we'd been right to fear them all along. She pulled up medical records next. Centuries of data on Nightwhisper wolves who'd never reproduced, comparing their health, longevity, and power stability to normal pack members. The data showed Nightwhispers lived slightly longer, manifested more stable power control, and had lower rates of the power dysregulation issues that occasionally affected strong wolves. Our bloodline isn't less stable, Aroha explained. It's more stable. The very trait that makes us Nightwhispers, our ability to hear and process the old magic directly, gives us better control over our own abilities because we understand them at a fundamental level. Then came Thoma's medical evaluations. 3 independent experts had examined the boy over the past week. Their reports were identical. Exceptional health, age-appropriate emotional development, power levels high but extraordinarily controlled for his age, no indicators of instability or danger. One expert, a wolf physician who'd specialized in power manifestation studies for 40 years, stated bluntly, "This child represents the healthiest power emergence I've documented in my career. If this is what Nightwhisper reproduction produces, the prohibition is not just unjust, it's actively harmful to pack genetic health." But the most dramatic evidence came last. Aroha activated the magical circle she'd prepared, and 3 entities manifested in the center of the chamber. They weren't fully physical, more like projections of consciousness that borrowed substance from the air and light around them. But they were present enough to speak, to testify, to validate Aroha's claims about the old magic. The first entity identified itself as a custodian of the separation, one of the beings who'd helped create shifters when the old powers withdrew from open interaction with the world. It spoke in harmonics that bypassed language, its meaning arriving directly in every witness's consciousness. "We created Nightwhispers as bridges. They hear us because they were meant to hear us. They were never dangerous. They were necessary. Your laws forbidding their existence have weakened the connection between shifter kind and the sources of your power. You are less than you were meant to be because you exiled the very wolves who could have kept that connection alive." The second entity corroborated Aroha's historical research, confirming that the Nightwhisper prohibition had been political from the start, designed by early councils to consolidate power by eliminating wolves who could verify truth directly through the old magic. It showed memories, not visions but actual memories transferred from its eternal consciousness to the witnesses, of council meetings 3 centuries ago where alphas explicitly discussed using the tragic cases as justification for eliminating a bloodline they found threatening to their authority. The third entity offered something unprecedented: a demonstration. It requested permission to temporarily amplify Tama's power, showing what the boy would become at full maturity. Aroha hesitated, looking to Kahu, who nodded. The entity's awareness touched Tama, and for 30 seconds, the 6-year-old blazed with silver light. Power poured from him, not destructive but creative. The stone floor beneath his feet began to grow, forming crystalline structures that sang with harmonic resonance. The air around him shimmered with possibility, with potential for growth and healing and connection. Then the entity withdrew, and Tama collapsed into his father's arms, exhausted but unharmed. The crystal structures remained, beautiful and functional, already being analyzed by experts who'd never seen anything like them. Power used for creation, not destruction. For beauty, not violence. For connection, not isolation. That, Aroha said into the stunned silence, is what Nightwhispers can offer Pack society. Not danger, not instability, but deeper connection to the sources of our power, abilities that go beyond fighting and territory defense, potential for contributions we haven't even imagined because we've spent 3 centuries suppressing the bloodline that could provide them. The entities dissolved, returning to whatever spaces they occupied beyond normal reality. Aroha stood alone on the platform again. Her evidence presented, her case made. Now came judgment. The council deliberated for 6 hours. The 7 alphas withdrew to private chambers while the assembled witnesses remained in the hall, speculation and debate filling the space. Kahu held Tama, the boy sleeping off the exhaustion of his brief power amplification. Aroha sat beside them, unable to speak, barely able to think, every moment stretching into eternity. Rengi Iron Soul brought food they didn't eat. Other Thornmere Pack members came to offer support or express concern. The faction led by Rawiri Stonefang remained conspicuously distant, watching, waiting to see if their fears would be validated or disproven. When the council finally emerged, every conversation in the hall died. 7 alphas took their positions, their faces revealing nothing. Hannah Stormcaller spoke first, as was traditional for the eldest council member. "We have reviewed the evidence presented by Aroha Nightwhisper regarding the 3-century-old prohibition on Nightwhisper reproduction and pack participation. We have consulted historical records, examined medical assessments, spoken with the entities from beyond the veil, and witnessed a demonstration of what Nightwhisper power can produce when not persecuted or suppressed. She paused, and Kahu felt Aroha's hand tighten around his. The council's decision is not unanimous. But by a vote of 5-2, we have determined that the Nightwhisper prohibition was based on incomplete information and political motivations that do not serve Pack society's legitimate interests. Therefore, effective immediately, the prohibition is revoked. Nightwhispers are no longer forbidden from reproducing or participating fully in Pack society. Existing exiles imposed solely on the basis of Nightwhisper bloodline are considered unjust and are hereby nullified. The hall exploded. Some wolves cheered, others shouted protests. Most simply sat in shocked silence as 3 centuries of law dissolved in a single announcement. Aroha collapsed against Kahu, tears streaming down her face. Not just relief, though that was there, but vindication. Recognition that she'd been right, that her family deserved to exist, that her son could grow up without fear of execution for circumstances of his birth. But Hannah wasn't finished. However, this decision comes with conditions. Nightwhispers who wish to reproduce must register with the council and submit to voluntary monitoring during pregnancy and their children's early development. Not because we believe them dangerous, but because we acknowledge our lack of experience with Nightwhisper child-rearing after 3 centuries of prohibition. We will learn together, with transparency and support, how to integrate this bloodline back into Pack society safely and healthily. She looked directly at Aroha. Your exile is officially ended. Your Luna status in Thornmere Pack is restored if you choose to reclaim it. And your son, Thomas Silverborn, is recognized as legitimate heir to the Silverborn Alpha line with no restrictions or asterisks attached to his bloodline. What about the packs that voted against this? Wiremu Ashbourne's voice carried across the hall. He'd been one of the 2 dissenting votes. What happens to territories that refuse to accept Nightwhispers under this new framework? Pack law allows for territorial autonomy in implementation, Hannah acknowledged. Each pack may set its own policies regarding Nightwhisper integration, provided those policies don't include execution or force permanent exile. Those are now prohibited across all council-governed territories. But yes, some packs may choose to maintain restrictions or discourage Nightwhisper presence. That is their right, just as it's Nightwhisper's right to choose which territories to live in. The hearing concluded, but the real work was just beginning. Over the following days, the implications of the council's decision rippled across New Zealand's shifter society. 2 packs, including Wiremu Ashbourne's South Island territory, announced they would maintain voluntary restrictions on Nightwhispers, not forbidding them but making clear they weren't welcome in leadership positions or mate bond formations with their pack members. 3 other packs, inspired by Thornmere's example, began actively searching for Nightwhispers who'd been living in hiding or exile, offering them integration assistance and protection. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. A message arrived at Thornmere from a Nightwhisper community in Australia, 63 wolves who'd fled New Zealand over the past century to escape persecution. They'd built their own society separate from pack governance, developing their connection to the old magic in ways council-governed packs had never imagined. And now, with the prohibition lifted, they wanted to come home. 63 Nightwhispers, Rengi Ironsoul said, reading the message aloud to Kahu and Aroha in their study. That's nearly 1/5 of Thornmere's total population. If they all settle here, and the message suggests they want to because this is where the council case was won, we'll become the most Nightwhisper-dense territory in history. Which will make us either the most powerful pack or the biggest target, Kahu mused. Rawiri's faction is going to lose their minds. Let them, Aroha said quietly. She'd spent the past few days reconnecting with Tama, re-establishing her place in pack society, reaching out to historians and researchers to begin documenting real Nightwhisper history to replace the propaganda of 3 centuries. We proved we were right. We changed the law. Now we build something better than what came before. But building something better meant confronting old wounds. That evening, Aroha went to find Rawiri Stonefang in his home on Thornmere's eastern boundary. The old wolf answered his door with suspicion clear in his eyes. "Come to gloat?" he asked. Come to thank you, Aroha replied, surprising him. You forced Kahu into a vote of confidence. You made him prove his commitment publicly. If you hadn't done that, when those 63 Nightwhispers arrive and some pack members inevitably panic, we'd be facing that challenge without the foundation of pack support we now have. You tested Kahu when the stakes were relatively manageable, and he passed. That will matter in the difficult times ahead. Rawiri studied her for a long moment. I still think you're dangerous. Not intentionally, I believe you mean well. But power like yours, concentrated in one territory, will draw attention. Other packs will see us as either threat or prize. We'll face conflicts. Probably, Aroha agreed. But we'll face them together as a pack, with everyone's concerns heard and addressed. That's all I've ever wanted. Not to hide what we are, but to contribute openly with the same rights and responsibilities as every other pack member. And if your son's power continues to grow, if he becomes something the council can't control or predict, then we'll deal with that when and if it happens. Based on evidence, not fear. Based on truth, not 300-year-old propaganda. Aroha extended her hand. I'm not asking you to trust Nightwhispers unconditionally. I'm asking you to give us the same chance you'd give any other pack member, to prove ourselves through actions, not genetics. After a long hesitation, Rawiri shook her hand. The gesture didn't erase his concerns or convert him into an enthusiastic supporter. But it established something crucial. Even opposition within the pack could be managed with respect and communication rather than forcing absolute unity. 3 weeks after the council decision, Aroha formally reclaimed her position as Luna of Thornmere Pack. The ceremony was both traditional and revolutionary, following ancient pack protocols while explicitly acknowledging that she was the first openly Nightwhisper Luna in modern history. She wore the torque that had briefly been on Mir's neck, that had been on her own neck for years before exile, and she stood before her pack to take the oath that bound Luna to territory and wolves. I swear to serve Thornmere with all my power and wisdom. She spoke the ancient words, her silver eyes reflecting firelight from the ceremonial bonfire. I swear to protect our young, honor our elders, and lead with justice tempered by mercy. I swear to value truth over comfort, growth over stagnation, and unity over forced conformity. I am Aroha Nightwhisper Silverborn, your Luna, and I will never again hide what I am or what I can offer. The pack howl that followed her oath shook the foundations of the pack house. Not unanimous. Some throats remained silent, some wolves still harboring reservations, but overwhelming. Thornmere had chosen its path, and that path included embracing the bloodline they'd been taught to fear. Tama participated in the ceremony for the first time, old enough now to understand what it meant. When asked to pledge his loyalty to his mother as Luna, he stood on a platform that made him visible to the entire pack and said clearly, I pledge loyalty to Luna Aroha, who is my mommy and who came back like she promised. And I promise to use my power to help everyone, even people who are scared of me, because that's what heroes do. The simple honesty of a 6-year-old cut through political complexity. Several wolves who'd been in Rawiri's faction found themselves wiping away tears, disarmed by a child's determination to be good despite the fear surrounding him. After the ceremony, as celebration spread through pack grounds, Kahu found Aroha standing alone near the sacred carvings, the ones that had glowed silver when Tama touched them that first day of her return. She traced the ancient wolf shapes with gentle fingers. Do you regret it? Kahu asked. The years of hiding, the exile, the fight to come back? Would you choose differently if you could start over? Aroha considered the question seriously. I regret that we had to fight for something that should have been our right from the beginning. I regret the 6 months I lost with Tama, the fear he lived with, the instability you had to manage alone. But the journey itself. Well, because it forced us to confront truths that pack society has been avoiding for centuries. It forced change that was 300 years overdue. And it proved that our son, that all Nightwhisper children, deserved to exist without apology or restriction. She turned to face him fully. We're not done, you know. This victory is just the beginning. 63 Nightwhispers are coming from Australia. More will emerge from hiding across New Zealand. We're about to completely reshape pack demographics and power structures. Some territories will resist violently. The council decision was 5-2. Those two dissenting alphas and their territories will become centers of opposition. We're looking at potentially years of conflict and negotiation. I know, Kahu said. And we'll face it together. Together, Aroha agreed, the word becoming a promise and a battle cry simultaneously. 6 months later, Thornmere had transformed. The Australian Nightwhispers had arrived in 3 waves, each group bringing skills and knowledge developed during their exile. They'd taught Thornmere wolves techniques for connecting with the old magic, methods for power control that exceeded anything in traditional pack training, and perspectives on shifter society that came from building something outside council governance. Tama was thriving. At 7 years old, his power had stabilized at levels that made medical experts revise all their assumptions about Nightwhisper development. He could manipulate stone and crystal, creating structures and tools that merged artistic beauty with practical function. He could hear the old magic clearly enough to translate its meanings for others, serving as a bridge between normal pack wolves and the deeper sources of their power. And he'd become friends with other Nightwhisper children arriving from hiding, forming the first generation of openly Nightwhisper youth in 3 centuries. But Kahu's warning about conflict had proven accurate. 2 territorial disputes had erupted with neighboring packs who viewed Thornmere's Nightwhisper integration as threatening. One had been resolved through negotiation and council mediation. The other remained tense, with border skirmishes and political maneuvering that suggested deeper confrontation ahead. Wairmu Ashbourne's South Island pack had gone further, attempting to establish a coalition of territories that would maintain Nightwhisper restrictions despite the council decision. He'd gained support from 4 smaller packs, creating a faction that openly opposed the integration movement. They weren't calling for renewed prohibition that would violate council law, but they were making life difficult for any Nightwhispers trying to settle in their territories, creating hostile environments that amounted to soft exile. And then there was the discovery that changed everything again. Aroha wasn't the only Nightwhisper who'd found the deep caves. In the Fjordland region, another Nightwhisper wolf had emerged from 2 years in even deeper caverns, carrying knowledge that made Aroha's revelations look preliminary. This wolf, Nikau Shadowwalker, aged and powerful beyond measure, claimed to have communed with entities that predated the separation itself, beings who remembered why magic and humanity had separated in the first place. Nikau arrived at Thornmere unannounced, simply appearing at the packhouse gates one dawn with a message. The Nightwhisper awakening isn't random. The old powers are preparing for something. They're strengthening the bridges. Us, because the separation is weakening. The veil between worlds is thinning. Within a generation, maybe less, the old magic will return to active presence in the world. And shifter kind needs Nightwhispers functional and integrated, not persecuted and scattered, because we're the only ones who'll be able to communicate with what's coming. The implications were staggering. If Nikau was right, the council's decision to revoke the Nightwhisper prohibition hadn't just corrected a historical injustice, it had accidentally prepared shifter society for a fundamental reality shift. The separation that had defined their world for millennia was ending, and Nightwhispers were about to become not just acceptable but essential. The emergency council meeting convened within 48 hours of Nikau's arrival. All 7 alphas gathered again in Wellington, but this time the tone was different. Not judgment but crisis management. Not politics but survival. Nikau presented his evidence. Testimonies from entities even older than those Aroha had contacted, geological and magical indicators that the veil was indeed thinning, historical patterns suggesting the separation had always been temporary, a pause rather than a permanent state. The old powers withdrew because humanity needed time to develop independently, Nikau explained, his aged voice carrying centuries of Nightwhisper knowledge. But they always intended to return. And when they do, everything we've built, pack society, territory laws, council governance, will mean nothing unless we can communicate with them as equals rather than children begging for scraps of understanding. Hannah Stormcaller looked older than her 3 centuries. You're saying the Nightwhisper prohibition wasn't just unjust, it nearly doomed us? Exactly, Nikau confirmed. If we'd maintained it for another generation, we'd have eliminated or scattered every wolf capable of bridging between pack society and the returning old powers. We'd have faced the Veil's collapse blind and helpless. Aroha's fight to revoke that prohibition wasn't just about her family, it saved our species. The 7 alphas absorbed this in stunned silence. Then Wiremu Ashbourne, who'd led opposition to Nightwhisper integration, spoke. If this is true, then my coalition's resistance to integration actively threatens pack survival. We need to dissolve it immediately and begin recruiting Nightwhispers rather than restricting them. Yes, Nikau agreed. And we need to do it fast. My deepest contacts with the old powers suggest we have 5 years, maybe 10, before the veil thins enough that entities begin manifesting regularly in our territories. We need Nightwhispers in every pack, trained, integrated, prepared to serve as translators and mediators. We need to transform from persecutors to partners with the bloodline that's about to become our most valuable asset. Aroha, attending the meeting as Thornmere's Luna and as the Nightwhisper who'd initiated this entire transformation, raised a hand. Before we start making plans, I need to know, what happens to the packs that refuse to integrate Nightwhispers? What happens to territories that maintain restrictions even after learning about the Veil's collapse? Hannah looked grim. The same thing that happens to any community that refuses to adapt to reality. They become vulnerable, isolated, eventually absorbed or destroyed by circumstances they refuse to acknowledge. So we're not just asking for integration anymore, Aroha said slowly, realizing the full scope. We're making it mandatory for survival. Any pack that doesn't embrace Nightwhispers within the next decade will be at catastrophic disadvantage when the old powers return. Yes, Nikau confirmed. And that will create new conflicts. Packs forced to integrate against their deep-seated prejudices. Nightwhispers demanded to serve communities that persecuted them for centuries. Power structures completely reshuffled as wolves who were considered dangerous exiles become essential infrastructure. He paused, his ancient eyes sweeping across the council. Aroha's fight was just the beginning. What's coming will make those battles look like minor disagreements. Kahu, standing beside Aroha, felt the weight of their son's future settling on his shoulders. Tama wasn't just a Nightwhisper child anymore. He was the first of a new generation that would have to navigate reality fundamentally different from anything Pack society had known. The boy would grow up in a world where the boundaries between magic and mundane, between normal wolves and Nightwhispers, between human society and the old powers, were all collapsing simultaneously. Then we start preparing, Kahu said firmly. We establish Nightwhisper training programs in every territory willing to host them. We document everything we're learning about the old magic and share it across pack boundaries. We build alliances specifically focused on integration support. And we start having honest conversations about the fact that everything we thought we knew about our world is about to change drastically. The council agreed. Plans were made, resources allocated, communications sent to every pack in New Zealand and beyond. The Nightwhisper Awakening, as it began to be called, shifted from Aroha's personal victory to a species-wide transformation. But as the meeting adjourned and wolves dispersed to begin the massive work ahead, Nikau pulled Aroha aside. His ancient face carried an expression between pity and respect. You need to know something, he said quietly, ensuring no one else could hear. The entities I spoke with in the deepest caves, the ones who remember the separation's beginning, they mentioned your son specifically. Aroha's blood ran cold. What about Tama? They called him the first bridge. Said he was the first Nightwhisper born after the veil began its weakening, which means his connection to both worlds, shifter society and the old powers, is stronger than any Nightwhisper in recorded history. Stronger even than yours or mine. Nikau's voice dropped to barely a whisper. When the old powers fully return, your son won't just be a bridge. He'll be the bridge. The primary connection point between our species and theirs. Everything will funnel through him. That's... Aroha couldn't finish the sentence. Too much. Too dangerous. Too impossible to protect against. That's why you were exiled and had to fight back, Nikau continued. The old powers needed you gone long enough to prove you could return. They needed your son born into resistance and victory, into a mother who'd fight the whole world for him. Because when the veil collapses, Tama will need that strength. He'll need a family and pack that chose him over tradition, that proved they'd stand with him against any opposition. The old powers don't intervene directly. They can't, but they influence. They ensure the right pieces are in place. And you, your mate, your son, you're the pieces they arranged. Aroha looked across the hall to where Thomas stood with Kahu, the boy laughing at something his father had said, blissfully unaware that his future had just been defined by forces beyond anyone's control. How much time does he have? Aroha asked. How much time before being just a happy child and becoming whatever the first bridge means? 5 years, Nikau said. Maybe 10 if we're lucky. Enjoy them. Because after that, nothing will be simple again. And in that moment, watching her son play, knowing what was coming but unable to stop it, Aroha understood that her fight had never been about ending persecution or proving Nightwhispers weren't dangerous. It had been about preparing her son to save everyone. Tama looked up, catching his mother's eyes across the council hall. He smiled, pure, uncomplicated, 7 years old and loved, and waved. Aroha waved back, her heart breaking and soaring simultaneously. 'Cause he was coming back. The old magic, the ancient powers, the world they'd all thought was safely separated. Everything was coming back. And her son would stand at the center of it all. The question wasn't whether he'd survive. The question was whether any of them would survive what Tama was about to become. The weeks following Nikau's revelation transformed Thornmere from a pack recovering from internal conflict into the epicenter of a species-wide preparation. Aroha threw herself into documentation, working 16-hour days to record everything she'd learned in the caves, everything the Australian Nightwhispers had brought with them, everything Nikau could share about the deeper knowledge he'd acquired. She was building an archive, not just for current packs, but for the generations that would navigate the post-separation world. Kahu watched her work with growing concern. She barely slept, barely ate, driven by a mother's desperate need to prepare her son for a destiny she couldn't prevent. He'd find her at 3 a.m, still writing, still researching, still trying to find some angle that would make Tama's future less terrifying. "You can't research your way out of this," he finally said one night, gently closing her journal despite her protest. "The old powers chose him. We can prepare him, train him, surround him with support, but we can't change what's coming. I can't just accept that my 7-year-old son is going to become some kind of cosmic bridge," Aroha snapped, exhaustion making her sharp. "I didn't fight the council, overturn 3 centuries of law, and risk everything just to hand him over to forces we don't understand. We're not handing him over. We're preparing him to handle something that's bigger than any of us." Kahu pulled her away from the desk, forcing her to face him. "He's not just our son anymore, Aroha. He belongs to pack history now. To shifter evolution. To whatever the old powers have planned. And the best thing we can do, the only thing we can do, is make sure he's strong enough, confident enough, loved enough to carry that weight." Aroha collapsed against him, finally letting the tears come. "He's 7. He should be worried about school and friends and learning to hunt properly. Not preparing to mediate between reality and whatever's coming through the veil." "I know." Kahu held her, offering no solutions because there were none. "But he's also Tama. Stubborn, brave, ridiculously powerful, and surrounded by people who'd die before letting him face this alone. That has to count for something." Training began in earnest. Not just for Tama, but for every Nightwhisper child in Thornmere and the growing number arriving from other territories. Nikau established what he called the Bridge Program, intensive education in old magic communication, veil sensitivity, entity recognition, and power control that went far beyond traditional pack training. Tama excelled. His natural abilities amplified by formal instruction. By 8 years old, he could sense veil fluctuations from kilometers away, could identify which entities were trying to communicate based on subtle changes in ambient magic, could create not just crystal structures but functional tools that channeled old power in ways that made the adult Nightwhisper study his techniques to improve their own skills. But the training came with costs. Tama started having nightmares. Visions of the veil collapsing, of entities pouring through, of standing alone trying to communicate with beings so vast they made mountains look small. He'd wake screaming, his power flaring uncontrolled, sometimes accidentally creating crystal formations in his bedroom that took hours to safely dismantle. Aroha would hold him through these episodes, singing traditional Nightwhisper lullabies that her own mother had sung to her, before the prohibition had forced their family into hiding. The songs spoke of wolves who walked between worlds, who carried messages between gods and mortals, who served as bridges not because they were forced but because they chose connection over isolation. "Mommy," Tama asked one night after a particularly bad nightmare, "what if I can't do it? What if the old powers come back and I mess up and everyone gets hurt?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Aroha promised. "You're not doing this alone, baby. Every Nightwhisper in New Zealand will support you. The council, the packs, your father and me, we're all here. You're the first bridge, yes. But you're also just Tama. And being Tama, being loved and supported and valued for who you are beyond your power, that's what will make you strong enough to handle being the bridge too. Promise. Promise." But even as she made the promise, Aroha knew it might be one she couldn't keep. Because the veil's collapse wasn't a negotiable event. It was coming whether they were ready or not, whether Tama was ready or not. And when it came, her 8-year-old son would stand at the center of forces that had last been active when human civilization was still young. The first major veil breach occurred 18 months after Nikau's warning, earlier than anyone had predicted. A section of the veil in Fiordland, one of New Zealand's most remote regions, thinned enough that an entity partially manifested. Not fully, not enough to be truly dangerous, but enough that every Nightwhisper in the country felt it simultaneously. Tama was in school when it happened. He stood up in the middle of math class, his eyes going completely silver, his voice changing to carry harmonics that made his human teacher back away in instinctive fear. "Something's coming through." In the south, is confused, doesn't understand why the world feels different than it remembers. The school evacuated. Aroha arrived within minutes, finding her son standing in the playground, still locked in that state between boy and bridge, sensing something hundreds of kilometers away. She didn't try to break his concentration. Nikau had taught her that interrupting a Nightwhisper during active sensing could cause psychological damage. Instead, she simply stood beside him, a hand on his shoulder, grounding him in family and pack while his consciousness ranged across distances to assess the breach. When Tama finally returned to himself, he looked exhausted and excited simultaneously. "I talked to it, Mommy." The thing that came through. It was scared. It didn't mean to breach the veil. It was just curious about why the separation felt different. "I explained about shifters and packs and how we've been living without the old powers for so long. And it understood. It went back through the veil voluntarily. It said it would tell others to wait, to be patient, to let the bridges prepare everyone before trying to manifest again." Aroha pulled him close, her heart racing. Her 8-year-old son had just successfully negotiated with an entity powerful enough to breach the veil, had prevented what could have been a catastrophic encounter, had proven that the old power's designation of him as first bridge wasn't arbitrary. He could do this. He was already doing this. And that terrified her more than anything. News of the Fiordland breach spread instantly. What had been theoretical, the veil's collapse, the old power's return, became concrete and immediate. Packs that had been dragging their feet on Nightwhisper integration suddenly scrambled to recruit them. Wiremu Ashbourne personally traveled to Thornmere to apologize to Aroha and request assistance establishing a Nightwhisper training center in South Island territory. "I was wrong," the scarred Alpha admitted, the words clearly costing him. Not just about the prohibition but about what resistance to Nightwhisper integration would mean. That breach. If your son hadn't been trained, prepared, empowered to communicate with what came through, it could have been disastrous. "We need Nightwhispers." We need them trained and supported and integrated everywhere. And I need help making that happen in territories that still carry prejudice and fear. Aroha accepted his apology but with conditions. Integration can't just be utilitarian. You can't welcome Nightwhispers only because they're useful for Veil management. We need full equality, full pack rights, full recognition that we were persecuted unjustly for 3 centuries. That means reparations. That means public acknowledgement of historical wrongs. That means ensuring Nightwhisper voices have genuine power in council decisions going forward. Agreed, Wiremu said without hesitation. Whatever it takes. Because the alternative, facing the Veil's collapse without Nightwhisper bridges, will destroy us all. The council's next meeting established the Nightwhisper Integration Act, formal legislation that went far beyond simply revoking the old prohibition. It mandated equal rights, established training programs with guaranteed council funding, created reparations funds for families that had suffered under persecution, and most significantly, added a permanent Nightwhisper council seat, ensuring that Bloodline would always have direct voice in pack governance. Aroha was offered that seat. She turned it down. I'm needed in Thornmere, raising my son and training the next generation. But Nikau Shadowwalker would serve brilliantly. He has the historical knowledge, the diplomatic skill, and the respect necessary to represent Nightwhispers at the highest level. Nikau accepted, becoming the first Nightwhisper to sit on the Council of Alphas in recorded history. His first official act was establishing the Bridge Network, a formal organization of all Nightwhispers dedicated to preparing for the Veil's collapse and managing entity communications when the old powers fully returned. And Tama, at 9 years old, became the Bridge Network's youngest member and, unofficially, its most important. 3 years after Aroha's return, Thornmere celebrated the autumn equinox with traditional ceremonies that now included Nightwhisper elements openly. Crystal structures that Tama and other young Nightwhispers had created decorated the pack grounds, their surfaces inscribed with messages in the old script that told the true history of their bloodline. Aroha stood with Kahu, watching their son, now 10 years old, led younger children in a demonstration of basic veil sensing techniques. He looked so confident, so comfortable with his power, so utterly unlike the terrified 6-year-old who'd spat in a stranger's face and screamed for his mother. He's going to be okay, Kahu said quietly, reading her thoughts as mates often could. When the veil collapses completely, when the old powers return in force, Tama will be ready. We've made sure of that. We've given him the best preparation possible, Aroha corrected. Ready is relative when you're talking about mediating between shifter civilization and cosmic entities. Fair point. Kahu pulled her closer. But he won't be alone. That's what matters. Whatever comes through that veil, he'll face it with family, pack, and an entire species that finally recognizes the value of what he is instead of fearing it. Aroha nodded, allowing herself a moment of hope. They'd come so far. From exile and prohibition to integration and preparation. From hiding what Tama was to celebrating it. From fighting for survival to building a future. The old powers were coming. The veil was thinning with each passing month. Within a few years, maybe sooner, the separation would end and shifter kind would face realities their ancestors had walked away from millennia ago. But they wouldn't face it blind or helpless or divided by prejudice and fear. They'd face it with bridges. With Nightwhispers standing ready to communicate, to translate, to connect 2 worlds that had been separated too long. And at the center of it all would be Tama, the first bridge, the boy who'd been exiled before he was born. Hidden for 6 years, reunited with his mother against all odds, and raised in a pack that chose love over law, truth over tradition, future over fear. Aroha watched him laugh with the other children, his silver eyes bright with joy and power in equal measure, and thought, whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Not as victims of prophecy, but as architects of tomorrow. Together.